Beginning my code, you can see I used include studio.h to use our normal functions, and you can see I included my user-defined functions, void addition, void subtraction, multiplication, and determinant. I believe for this project we were only asked to use a user-defined function to return the determinant, but I decided that I would be able to keep my code more organized if I made user-defined functions for addition, subtraction, and multiplication. So moving on, of course, initially in the main function, I created a variable for choice, and I prompted the user to select what result they wanted to see. And then I used scanf to detect what that choice was. And then I carried that over to my if and else if statements within the code for the different choices. So beginning each if or else if statement, the code displays what has been chosen and then prompts the user for rows, columns, different elements, etc. So for choice A, I used a for loop so that if the dimensions weren't inputted properly, it would go back to the beginning, and if this was the second time that this loop had run, an error message would be printed and would warn the user that they need to make sure the dimensions match. And then of course I have a break statement for if the conditions are fulfilled so that the code will actually run. So I then ask for elements, print the matrices that had been inputted, and then I carried those inputs over into the addition and subtraction functions that I had made based on whether the user wants to do addition or subtraction, which is controlled by a switch. So moving on to choice B, I had solved how to find matrix multiplication in my pseudocode, and implementing it wasn't too terribly difficult. The hardest part was wrapping my head around the different loops, where k needed to be, and keeping track of what row and column needed to go where. So then going back up to here, I of course once again prompted for row and column numbers, different elements, and then I printed all the results. So then for choice C, if the user wanted to see the matrix transpose, this I didn't do a user-defined function for because it's such a short code. Here you can see you just need a new matrix called transpose to put the old elements into, just with the rows and columns switched, which I did with the I and the J, just in the opposite orders. And then I printed the result. And then for choice D, of course, like I said, I used the user-defined function to find the different determinants after prompting for elements. And then by hand, I decided to do Cramer's rule. So you can see I created a new matrix for each determinant. So I could find my d, dx, dy, and dz. And you can see here on this row, for example, I put in db where it needed to be for each matrix. And then I, of course, had the x, y, and z values solved as floats. So the first issue that I had run into when trying to implement my code was that I initially intended to use a do-while statement to ask for the dimensions within the choice A code. This would run the code once and then loop only if the dimensions didn't match. I then realized that I wouldn't be able to print a message telling the user what the issue was with their input using a do-while loop. So I instead opted to use a for loop with an if statement at the beginning that would print the warning statement. And that would only happen during the second and every following loop. So then acting in place of a do-while loop, I also included an if statement at the end of the loop to break it when the dimensions matched. I believe I talked a little bit about this. So moving on, I also had an issue that I ran into was that I was using a switch function with a choice variable to go between cases for each user chosen result. Once I started defining matrices within case A and scanning and printing elements, I realized that something was not working. After some research, I found out that one of the constraints of the switch function is that you can't define a new matrix within it. So to get around this issue, as you can see, I removed the switch and changed all of the case lines to if and else if statements, which ended up working a lot better for my purposes. Overall, this project was more tedious than it was challenging, and I actually found that I didn't have as hard of a time with it as I thought I would. Thank you.